Well, hi everyone, it's Scott here. What I'd like to do now is go through the presentation that I gave at Cobb and Co Museum almost 2 months ago. It was live streamed at the time. This was on how to attract birds to your garden, but the live stream wasn't the best quality. I think the phone connection kind of wasn't strong enough, or the bit rate got a bit compressed at times with the upload. So even though that is available online on the Bird Bites Facebook page, I think it's great to do a high quality presentation now. So I'm capturing this straight off my desktop computer. Feel free to pause this video and just look at any of the screens in detail as you like as we go through. So this is how to attract birds to your garden. Presentation given on the 7th of September 2022. It's now the 1st of November, so just a couple of months later. So this is what we're going to look at. Why would birds come to your yard? What are they looking for? The design of your garden and how to provide these things. Providing food and water, the do's and the don'ts of that, which is very important. The role of backyards in bird conservation and biodiversity. Birds you're likely to attract to your garden, and mixed flocks. And you'll see on each screen I've got some different birds, some pale-headed rosellas here. You might like to just see if you can ID the birds as you go through. That was a fun thing I did with the crowd on the day. Okay. So, why would birds come to your yard? What are they looking for? So the main things are food, protection and safety, water, and the possibility of nesting sites. I mean, that's a nice female superb fairy wren there. The way that the beak matches the colour of the ring around the eye is our best indicator that that's what that is. Right, so these are the dietary types of birds, and I won't go through all of them in detail here, but this would be a good one to stop and just read through. It's pretty amazing. I didn't even know about half of these. So coprivores, see over on the second from the top on the right hand side, they just eat excreta from animals. So Egyptian vultures eat cow dung. A lot of these you might be familiar with. But there's quite a few I'd never heard of. Pergamenivores, processed food made by humans. And noisy miners are well adapted to that now, aren't they? But anyway, just browse through that and we'll keep going on to the next screen now. Right, many birds have a mixture of dietary types and they fall into these three categories. Herbivores, faunivores and omnivores, which are a mixture of both above. The most common dietary types in backyard birds are insectivores, granivores, frugivores, and nectarivores. So what we want to do is create an environment where arthropods, seeds, fruit, and nectar-rich plants can thrive. So that's basically providing all of the food sources that these birds need. Obviously, they need more than just food, but just to satisfy their dietary needs, these are the most common types of diets that we're looking for in backyard birds. And look at that noisy frybird. They always remind me of something out of Dr. Seuss. I think they're quite amazing, the look on those birds. Okay, so insectivores, sorry. A garden that is, so what we want is a garden that is rich in insects and arthropods. So no pesticides, plenty of mulch and leaf litter, dense bushing of foliage, so little to no pruning, insect attracting plants, and remember to plant non-nectar rich natives, so like wattles and silky oaks. Just think you're planting for the insects, not the birds. And the point there about the little to no pruning, it's about creating depth within the foliage. So there's lots of hidey holes for spiders and other arthropods or insects. I know that prune bushes can work as well, but I think a greater variation and I suppose a more natural plantscape, or I don't really know what the word is, the patterning of the foliage is more successful if it's more natural and there's more just natural variation in it. Just plenty more hidey holes basically. Okay, so frugivores. So now this is an important point. It's very important to grow local species because the seeds that these birds eat and excrete are going to get spread throughout the area. Okay, so you don't want to be spreading weed species basically. And also, if you're growing locally adapted fruit trees, then the local native birds, of course, are going to be adapted to them already. Like all native plants, they will be adapted to your local conditions. And this is really important for trees that they have an extra load creating fruits and berries. So if you're picking trees that are already adapted to your local climatic and soil conditions, then they're going to be far more successful in producing fruits and berries. Now, these trees, they can be used, and I guess this is true for all trees, not just for fruit-bearing trees, but they can be used as standalone refuge trees. So they're not surrounded by other trees or fighting for resources, because obviously they want as much nutrition and resources as they can get themselves. But we'll talk a little bit later in terms of the design of the garden. It's good to have some standalone trees spaced anywhere from like 5 to 8 meters apart. So you kind of doing two things here specifically. That's creating staging points for smaller birds, which we'll talk about, but also you're favouring the tree to get the most resources that it can itself, just by having it set apart by itself. But they could also be in a built garden near hedges and so on. But there's a great opportunity to kill, terrible expression, but to kill two birds with one stone by putting fruit trees kind of separate space throughout your garden. And so just think, you plant specifically for the birds, not for yourself. Obviously, you might have your own fruit trees, but any fruits or berries that the native birds in your area favour, look at planting just for their purposes, not your own. Okay, nectarovores. So I think we know pretty much all the Australian trees, grevilleas, callistemons, and so on. Now, we have an abundance of highly nectar-producing plants in Australia, and the thinking behind that is because we have poor soil and strong sunlight. These plants can't create large, thick wooded trunks in the areas where there's poorer soil. So by excreting all this extra nectar, it's a way of getting rid of the byproducts of photosynthesis, which of course is in overdrive with the amount of sunlight they're getting. And this is why we have some of the most aggressive and territorial birds in the world, particularly our honeyeaters. But the thing with these birds is that they won't be exclusively nectarvores. They'll also be omnivores, and they'll require insects to get minerals and other elements that they need. So some of these birds will actually go into an energy deficit catching an insect. So it takes more energy to catch than they're actually extracting from that insect, but they're extracting other things that make it worthwhile for them. This is something we'll look at too. Don't overdo the nectar-producing plants, because you don't want to have a backyard full of aggressive birds that are going to chase everything else off. Okay, so there's a bit of a balance here, which we'll look at. And granivores. So, and look at that lovely female glossy black cockatoo up there in the right-hand corner. I took that photo just around the corner from here. It's just with my mobile phone, but I was thrilled to bits when she and her partner turned up. Okay, so granivores, grains, obviously, seeds, flowering plants, cones, grasses. And it's good to think about grasses separate to the actual lawn that you're growing as well. So think about it going to seed. It's not just a lawn, or just planting grasses just specifically so they can go to seed. All right, now the importance of the lawn, and I've got my cat here trying to help me. Can you go away, please, mister? Off you go. That's, in fact, that cat, I don't know if you heard him meow, but you're going to see a photo of him shortly. He's a little bit put out because he's not getting attention right now. That's Indy the tabby cat. Anyway, yeah, he features in this presentation, I just remembered. Okay, so the importance of lawn. Okay, now, it can be a great resource for many bird dietary types. So it can be a hunting ground for birds looking for insects and arthropods. Good example of superb fairy wrens. If you let it go to seed and just go a little bit shaggy, you can get little granivores there like red-browed finches. And mind you, all the birds I'm quoting here are ones that I get in my area on the Great Dividing Range in southeast Queensland. Of course, you may not get them where you are, but you'll have something equivalent filling that niche. And then also you get birds that eat grass stems and roots, so like galahs and corellas. But small birds will only be able to utilise a wide open lawn if they have safe areas to retreat to. And this is what I was getting at before with the staging trees. So if you think about a superb fairy wren, and they're not very good flyers, and how much distance they're prepared to fly between one safe space to another. So you would need, my estimate's about 8 metres at the most, 10 metres maybe. And of course it doesn't have to be fruit trees, but between these trees or hedges that you've got space out to provide a bit of safety for the birds. Okay. So let's look at a red-browed finch having a nice munch here. So you can see this lawn is just a little bit shaggy. I hate seeing lawns that are mowed within an inch of their life. And you get some great vision here of him just stripping the little grass seeds off. Okay. Now here we have a superb fairy wren, male superb fairy wren doing his thing. And of course he's foraging and hunting. They have such fast movements, don't they? But you've got to remember with birds, the acuity and the eyesight's so much better than mammals, and even though the brains are so small, the neuron density is so much higher as well per given volume. I think it's around about 4 times higher than mammals, 3 to 4 times higher. So they have a lot more neurons in a lot smaller space, and it's being powered by eyesight that's so much more powerful as well. Okay. And look at this long-billed corella. Isn't he gorgeous? And we've got a little corella in the background that was also joining him. This was a flock of probably about 8 long-bills, and this one little corella was just visiting. So they like digging out the roots and just the juicy stems of grass as well. Okay, so nectar-rich plants and sparse open spaces favour aggressive birds. When birds are foraging and feeding, they are vulnerable to attack and predation, especially small birds. So while they're feeding, they're looking down at frequent intervals. They're distracted. They're often in exposed areas like a lawn. And so if you look at these birds here, these are all reasonably aggressive birds. Rainbow lorikeet, noisy miner, pied currawong, and a kookaburra. Of course, the latter two there will eat chicks and smaller birds as well. So providing protection and safety for little birds. So it's about creating a safe environment for all birds. The yard should have a number of refuge shrubs spaced throughout it. The distance apart will depend on the flight initiation distance of the bird, and that will vary between the species and also within the species. So the flight initiation distance is basically how close you can get to the bird before it starts flying. So I guess really there's 2 factors. There's the strength of how well they fly, but also the flight initiation distance. And that tells you how far away a bird wants to be from safety. So if its flight initiation distance is 5 metres, then it's going to want to be within 5 metres of safety, basically. And, rough rule of thumb, I don't think any of these little shrubs should be spaced more than 8 to 10 metres apart if possible, just depending on your own setup. Small birds are not, some birds are not only small and vulnerable, they also aren't strong flyers, especially the fairy wrens. And you need to remove threats like cats. So let's have a look at cats. So this is a cat that was just hanging around before looking for a pet. This is Indy. He was a rescue from the RSPCA actually, and he lived a little bit of his time on the streets, and he's covered in scars, hence we called him Indy after Indiana Jones. But he is still pretty keen on catching birds, so we don't let him do that. And here he is eyeing off an eastern yellow robin, which is pretty amusing. But anyway, let's just look at a few facts here about cats and birds, right? So according to a 2020 CSIRO study, Australia has 3.7 million pet cats and 2.1 million feral cats. So pet cats kill about 230 million native animals per year. Okay, I'll just re-emphasise that. That's pet cats. That's not the feral cats. And pet cats live in higher densities than feral cats, so they kill up to 50 times more birds per square kilometre, simply because there's more of them. And only about 30% of pet cats in Australia are actually contained. So according to the RSPCA, cats kept indoors live longer and are also healthier. If you can't keep them indoors, and it'd have to be pretty extenuating circumstances, meaning that you can't, but if you can't, then you can put bells on them, and you can even get reflective collars that will just stimulate the birds. You can get them. I haven't actually seen them. I've just heard about them, that the colours they reflect in, and they might even do some of it beyond the visible spectrum that birds can actually see. But it's meant to be tuned for the birds to notice them. And here's another clip of Indy here with two friends. I've actually got one somewhere, I can't find it, of him going head first into a glass window trying to catch a bird, and he learned after that. I don't think he was impressed, but anyway. Okay, so now let's look at another component of a bird-friendly garden, and that's water. So we'll look first at naturally occurring water features, and not a lot of people will have these in their yard, of course, but if you do, you want to reduce or prevent access by livestock, or even pets for that matter, to prevent trampling of plants and the fouling of the water. Plant native grasses, sedges, and story the foliage on the edge, and control weeds, especially aquatic weeds, so the birds still have good access to the water. Now, not a lot of us will have natural water bodies in their yards, but if you're lucky and you do, the more that you can keep it in as pristine state as possible, the better it is, not just for the birds, but everything else that's going to use it as well. Okay, now nesting sites. So this is kind of like an optional thing, but particularly if you're in suburbs, because the size of your yard's very small, and you just may not be able to provide what they have, what particular species need. So depending on your yard location and nesting requirements of the birds, not a lot of all of this may be in your control. So the ideal is to create an environment that provides the resources and safety that the birds need to nest. So you want to provide the environment that just gives them leaves, grasses, bark, sticks, twigs, moss, lichen, mud, even spider webs. But you can assist by making lawn clippings available and animal hair, but not human hair. So human hair is just a bit too long and strong, and birds can actually get wrapped in it and can't break it. And animal hair, so if you've brushed your dog or cat or whatever, you'll have lots of short hair. You can just let that blow around somewhere in your garden, but don't do it after you've shampooed them or put any insecticide on them or anything like that, like a tick treatment or whatever. Only if it's quite natural. And then you've also got nesting boxes, which you might be able to provide. So you want to put the nesting box at some distance so the birds have got a bit of privacy, and you've got some degree of control over who uses it by the size of the entrance, of course, and the actual box. You want to be able to observe these, but not put the birds off. And it's a really big deal for a bird if they know they're being looked at. If you can put it in a way that you can kind of or in a place where you can surreptitiously look at it, where it's not obvious for the bird that you're looking at it, then you'll have far more success. And I was just lucky enough, because I live on a few acres, to have some sacred kingfishers nesting here, and they're out at the moment. Actually, this was filmed last year, December last year, and they're actually in this same termite mound. They've re-excavated it and they're back again. But again, this is just down to, I guess, good fortune in having these kind of resources on the property where I live. So look at that. So it's very much hit and miss what you can and can't do nesting, but just provide as much as is realistic within your environment. Okay, so to have a successful bird-friendly garden, we can see that we need a garden that provides some or all of these things: nectar, insects, fruit and berries, seeds, both on plants and the lawn, protection and safety, water, and nesting sites. So how do we arrange all these elements? Now, this is obviously not a garden. This is a bit of bush that I've just put this slide in here. This is a nature reserve not far from where I live. It's a very, very small nature reserve, but there's a huge amount of nesting that goes in here just because of the mature trees, mainly parrots and cockatoos. But you can see the stories on the three layers of the vegetation there, and this is something that we want to try and replicate. So you've got the upper, the middle, and the lower story, and I've just included this slide just because it's a really clear example of that kind of effect. And you want to kind of replicate that as much as possible in your backyard as well, because different birds will favour different stories, so you need that kind of density and variation. Now, what kind of plant types should you consider for your yard? Now, this will vary where to do this right, you've really got to tie it into what's in your local area, and that's going to vary all around Australia. So I've got a list of plant types on the left-hand side. Whether or not they're relative to your local area is something that you're going to have to find out just by doing your own research. But most of these, as you go down the list there on the left, most of them won't be a surprise to anyone. So use local nurseries and ask for local species wherever possible. Just where I live near Toowoomba, there's a huge variation just in the natives in our area. So this crow's nest, which is I think about 30 kilometres north of Toowoomba, the escarpment, so the side of the Great Dividing Range, and then the western woodlands we have probably like 20 k's out to the west. There's a huge variation, not just in the birds, but in the native plants as well. So that's just in my local area, let alone the variation you're going to get where you are, wherever you're in Australia. So really use local nurseries and local species. I think, as everyone's probably aware now, there's a bit of a rush planting just grevilleas everywhere, probably in the 90s, and that's aided the spread of rainbow lorikeets and noisy miners are in much higher numbers than they ever used to be like 30 years ago. So people were trying to plant native and they were just grabbing almost like a pre-formatted grevillea, the Ned Kelly or whatever, from a big, retailer, hardware store. I don't want to name names, but you know what I mean. Like, you don't want like the generic type of bottle brush or whatever, and then just spread it all over the place. Just get things that are very specific to your area. Right, and now this photo was taken a little while ago. This is my front yard, and yeah, I've got to admit, if you look at that row down of plants down the front here, we haven't got that right. So, but what is going well, and I guess this is quite a few years ago before I'd really started to educate myself on what was required. But we have got the storing of the plants now. We've got some gum trees kind of around the back, and then some wattles and hedges and things in that garden bed on the left. And so this garden works really, really, and in fact most of the footage here that was taken in this garden, the long-billed corellas weren't, but it just works really well. There's something for little birds, there's heaps of protection, something for larger birds. So there's a lot of variation here, and with a slightly better selection of plants down the middle, not all the grevilleas that I've got, then you're going to really get the best result that you can. So these are the kind of principles that you need, and it's just a matter of putting them into your local space, in your local area. Okay, so now let's look at providing food, the do's and don'ts of that. Now, this is something that I used to actually do a lot, right from when I was a little kid through to now, and I don't do it anymore because I'm more interested in creating an environment where the birds can look after themselves. But I do know people do it because they want to help birds and they want to have some kind of interaction, which is particularly me. When I was a kid, I really wanted the interaction with birds. So it is going to happen. So it's important to do it as best as you can, all right? So some of the problems that happens here, you've got behavioural effects on birds, nutritional effects on birds, disease transmission, and you can even have disputes with neighbours. So the behavioural effects, so you can get birds, they won't usually, the research kind of shows that they'll look at feeding stations more as a top-up, but you still don't want them becoming reliant, and having birds sitting out there waiting for you, it might look cute, but it's actually not, okay? So They'll still source food from the wild, but you don't want to break that down, okay? So you don't want them to become reliant. So, and you can even attract birds of prey, actually, wanting to pick off birds that have been eaten, that have just had a feed. So the nutritional effect, birds can become too full of food that's not well balanced and not seek all they need from the wild just because they get filled up. So if you look at mince for magpies and butcherbirds, this can cause bone metabolic disease because the phosphorus to calcium ratio is not 1-to-1 but 17-to-1. And this will cause, I haven't got pictures of it here, but you can get horrible bone and beak deformities, including beaks that either break off or just deformed. And then bread, now it's just nutritionally empty. It's not so much that it's really bad itself. It's just that it's just carbohydrates and nothing else. And ducks, again, if they get filled up on something, right, they'll get fed too much of this. And then they can develop a bone disease called angel wing that prevents them from being able to fly. And then they become more reliant on handouts because they're kind of stuck in the one area. Sunflower seeds are way too oily and can actually cause some cholesterol and weight problems for some birds. And birds that are artificially fed have a much, much higher parasite load. And we think this is because their system's not functioning as well as it should because they're not getting the variation in the diet, and they're also not having to go foraging as much as they should. So their activity levels and their health levels just aren't as good as they should. And this high parasite load can eventually kill them. And then you've also got disease transmission. So you're putting species in close proximity that normally aren't that close. And it might be interesting to look at the interaction between a galah and a rainbow lorikeet, or a bronze-winged pigeon and a galah, and, kind of work out the pecking order and all that kind of stuff. But these birds aren't meant to be that close together. So you've got transmission of diseases between birds that usually aren't close enough for that to happen. And you've also got food and feeding surfaces that mix with moisture, feces, and gastric pellets. So it's just a ripe ground for bacterial growth. And then, of course, you're going to have, at night, you're going to have rats and possums go through and eat stuff and defecate there as well. And birds that get infected here, you're most likely not going to see their bodies. You're not going to see them die, so you're going to think everything's fine. But it's not, basically. So the disease transmission is a big issue. So one of the diseases that they can get is beak and feather disease. So we'll look at what you can do in a minute, but I'm just kind of going over the negatives first, okay? So beak and feather disease, it's a virus that we believe it originated in Australia. It affects captive and wild birds. It kills feather and beak cells, so it causes deformity in feathers and beaks as it kills the cells. The virus multiplies in the liver, and it'll be transmitted orally in feces and in feathers, and it's a very long-lived virus. It can even just survive for years in nest hollows, so subsequent birds can pick it up. Most infected birds die from it, but those that do survive can develop an immunity, and there's no known cure for this. And it's a major threat to endangered species. So when you've got wild populations, small wild populations of endangered birds like swift parrots and the Norfolk Island green parrots, they've had some of it go through. They've had to go through some of their populations. And I believe the orange-bellied, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I heard this, the orange-bellied parrot captive breeding program has had it gone through there as well. So it's a big threat to birds that have very small population numbers. And it is mainly associated with parrots, but a lot of other birds can get it as well. So let's just have a look at this footage here. This is pretty heartbreaking. This is a wild population of sulphur-crested cockatoos I filmed in northern Queensland last year. And I expect these guys are probably dead now. Look at that, it's so sad, isn't it? And that one just on the right there is okay at the moment. So it's either yet to get it, or maybe it's got a resistance to it. I mean, it's pretty horrible stuff. Okay, so what can you do and what shouldn't you do? So research what food suits the kinds of birds you're wanting to feed and provide a properly balanced diet. Vary the food amounts and the times of day to discourage any predictability. So like I was saying before, the bird sitting there waiting for you is not actually cute, okay? Clean every day. So you want to sweep, wash, disinfect and dry, and wash your hands afterwards too, so you're not transmitting anything. So that's every day, okay? Sweep, wash, disinfect and dry. And there's a fantastic book by Darryl Jones called Feeding the Birds at Your Table, A Guide for Australia. I would really recommend that as a good resource for a lot of the information that you need to do this safely, okay? Now, don't feed meat eaters mince or raw meat, mealworms, even pet food's better, but don't just give them the raw meat as we were talking about. And don't use your cleaning equipment for any other purpose, including cleaning your water dish. So you want a separate brush for both the food and the water. You don't want to be transmitting anything from one surface to another. Okay, so providing water. So let's look at some of the do's and don'ts for water dishes. So this is artificial water, okay? Now, every garden could actually have one. This is very important in hot weather and during drought. So I'll look on this far more favourably than I do on feeding birds. But you've got to remember that the birds are going to drink, bathe and defecate in it. It's not a river that self-cleans, basically. It's going to turn into a cesspool if you don't keep cleaning it. Crows are also going to drop water in there to soften it up. To drop food in there into the water to soften it up, like old bones or bread. They'll do things like that. And again, you've got many different species coming together that normally wouldn't be that close together. And there's a high risk of contamination and disease transmission, and also the growth of the possibility of the growth of toxic algae in there as well. So what do? You clean and dry it daily, place close to shrubs for protection so the birds can retreat quickly. They're exposed again while they're out there drinking or bathing. Don't put it directly under branches or leaves because you want to prevent things falling in there, but have it close enough for the birds to fly back and forth safely. And if you have horse troughs or large buckets of water around for whatever reason, put a trellis or a stick in there for birds to escape. There's nothing sadder than finding a drowned bird that couldn't get out of a bucket. Okay. And also with the bird bath, so make it so deep that a small bird can stand in it, and don't make it. Don't make it so deep a small bird can't stand in it. Let me read this correctly, okay? So it's look here with these red-browed finches, they're able to stand in that, and it's not too deep for them, so they've got no danger of drowning because they can basically stand and touch the bottom. And don't have it close to a feed table either because of contamination of food going in there. And also I think the activity and the number of birds together, again, it's just better to separate them out. Now I want to play this video. This was 2018, I think it might have been. So it's back when we had a drought here, and this is just some highlights from my bird bath that I ran the camera for an hour, and this is just a few edited highlights. You know what? I won't identify any of the birds. Maybe you could go through and put them in the comments. You might like to do that. I'm pretty sure I've got this clip separately on the Bird Bites YouTube and Facebook channel as well. But particularly in times of drought, just having a water source out there is just a brilliant help for them. And I know I've got no audio here, but when you do hear the audio, the wings just go. Brrr. They just kind of whir. Okay, so let's look at the role of backyards in bird conservation. In 2022, the Biological Conservation Journal published an article, or a paper I should say, Big Changes in Backyard Birds, an analysis of long-term changes in bird communities in Australia's most populous urban regions. So 4 major urban areas in Australia were studied: Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Perth. And the data that was analysed came from BirdLife Australia's bird data and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's eBird. So bird data has 18 million records from 1954 onwards, and eBird has 600 million records from 1954 onwards. But remember, that's a global database, and not all of the information in there has specific latitude and longitude data either. The way, which we'll look at shortly, but the way information is recorded in bird data is far more useful actually for analysis. And this is something I would encourage everyone to do, is to download the bird data app, and you can see that's the login screen on the left. On the right, it's very easy to record what you've seen. You define the area you're doing it, and you get a list of all the birds that like a running list of everything that you've seen. But all of this goes into this huge big national database here of all these sightings of all different birds. And if you look on the left-hand side with the filter there, you can start to drill down and select a species or select an area and just start to look at the population trends in that area. And so this is not far from where I live, Toowoomba. And if you look on the top right, there's 224 species have been counted just within that area that I've defined or I've selected there. So in this actual study, they use bird data and eBird information to they analysed the survey list and looked at the trend in the likelihood of a bird being seen over time. So what this showed us is that the biodiversity, or the number of bird species being seen in these 4 areas, remember, the biodiversity is decreasing across urban environments. And this includes most introduced birds, including common or Indian miners, house sparrows, that they're decreasing, but interestingly, rock doves are actually increasing. That's your common everyday pigeon. Some native birds are increasing, but many are decreasing, including kookaburras, magpie larks, galahs, black-faced cuckoo shrikes. They're all declining in 3 of the 4 areas studied. And when you look at particularly some of the nesting requirements of these birds, especially kookaburras and galahs, then it's not surprising they're declining as large trees are taken down for urban development. And so the biggest problem is actually urban spread and the densification of urban environments that precludes, and unnecessarily precludes, I would emphasise, large trees and wildlife corridors and just habitat that these birds can utilise. So the birds that are actually successful in urban environments, they have a larger body size, they have an aggressive nature, they have an omnivorous diet or a nectivorous diet. So what does that tell us? Okay, they're large, they're aggressive, so it's harder for other birds to attack them. They have an omnivorous diet, so highly flexible, or a nectivorous diet, and that suits, of course, the explosion in grevillea planting and things like that. So let's look at some of the trends here now. I've just pulled out Brisbane, and what you're looking at here is the likelihood of these different species being seen over the period that they looked at. So let's just go back to the period they were looking at. So from 1954 onwards, okay. And if you look at the top left there, so pale-headed rosellas, there's now less chance of seeing them. The ones that have increased are on the bar goes out to the right. So look right down at the very bottom right-hand corner. And you can pause this and just start reading through in detail if you like. But now we've got much more chance of seeing noisy miners, welcome swallows, little corellas, blue-faced honeyeaters, pied currawongs, Australian brush turkeys, Lewin's honeyeater, rainbow lorikeets, bar-shouldered doves, rainbow beater, grey butcherbird, tawny grassbird, which is interesting, fantail cuckoo, superb fairy wren, Australasian figbird. So this is in Brisbane, of course. Interesting environment in some areas in Brisbane, so there's a bit of variation there. But look at the birds that are now decreasing. Pale-headed rosella, spotted dove, crested pigeon, common starling, which is good. Black-faced cuckoo shrike, house sparrow, oriental dollar bird, silver-eyed galah, eastern cole, magpie lark. Yeah, so it's pretty sad. And if we look at the probability now of these 4 species. Look at the ones, so look at the eastern rosella, I guess very, very rare. You're going to get them in Brisbane anyway, but they've dropped in Melbourne and Sydney, the house sparrow. And it's interesting, an introduced bird like a house sparrow dropping in all of the areas, although they're not in Perth, in Brisbane, Melbourne and Sydney. And I think they're getting some competition. They obviously came out here far more adapted to human urban environments with their European history than the Australian birds were, but I think Australian birds are starting to pick up and get a bit of competition. And so we've got larger birds that might predate on them or their chicks, like currawongs now being adapted to cities. They're relatively common in urban centres now. I remember seeing some in Brisbane in the early 2000s and was very, very surprised, and now you get them in the Brisbane CBD. Noisy miners, of course, going up, and rock doves, but again, a bit like the house sparrows, well adapted to this, pre-adapted, let's say, to this environment, although it's concerning that they're going up, unlike the house sparrows that were going down. So what can you do? Plant plenty of bushy shrubs for protection for the smaller birds, minimise nectar-producing plants, encourage insects and an insect-supporting garden, and participate in bird data. So you and your garden actually have a role to play in saving our biodiversity. And it just requires just that little bit more thinking and that little bit more effort to create a garden that's going to suit lots of other birds, not just, the aggressive rainbow lorikeets, okay? So here are plenty of birds that are common in backyards at the moment. Certainly where I am in southeast Queensland. That group of sparrows was interesting. They're all flocking in a hedge. There probably would have been about 40 of them there when I filmed that. And if you're lucky, you can start to get some really interesting things happen. So it's probably only a year ago I noticed speckled warblers in my yard, and I reckon there's 2 pairs, and they have bred just recently. If you scroll back on, now when did I put it up? It's November now. It'll probably be on Facebook around, probably not long after I did this presentation, probably around late September. Just scroll through all the posts and you'll see a baby speckled warbler being fed by its dad. And if I haven't put that up on YouTube, I better correct that and stick it up there as well. I tend to put things on Facebook first. But here's one, what do we got here? A male speckled warbler just foraging in my yard. So when you get birds that you don't expect to get, it's just a real thrill, because the garden's going really well then. And a white-browed scrub wren. Now look, this is not the best video, but I love these little birds. They're chock-a-block full of character and they never sit still. So from a filming point of view, they are just so hard to get. It's great. Yeah, it's very rewarding if you get half decent footage of these guys. And I very rarely see I don't see these out foraging on the lawn. Sometimes I'll see them on the lawn as they're moving from one area to another, but in their natural habitat out in eucalypt forests, or in fact we even get them in pine forests here in amongst the lantana, or in rainforests. They just like the leaf litter and the undergrowth. Yeah, it's hard to predict where they're going to move, but if you get a bit of footage, it's pretty rewarding. Yeah, and now yellow rump thornbill. So these are one bird that's adapted quite well now to some urban areas. Okay, now every probably from about June, July, August, not really, maybe into September, I get Jackie Winters that turn up, and they're very acrobatic in the way they hunt insects. They like perching. I'm pretty sure they're more altitudinal migrants. They're coming up from the edge of the range, I believe. I don't quite know, but they'll just sit up high, find something, eat it, and then go back up high again. Yeah, they're hard birds to film because of the quick sudden movements, but they're very entertaining to watch as they just kind of pounce from a bit of a height. So they very rarely just get on the ground and foraging through on the ground. So what I'm trying to get at here now is that you can end up with mixed flocks working your yard. And so a mixed flock is where you have birds of similar habits moving together in a loose kind of a group. And there'll be very little competition between them. So they'll either have different diets or different foraging techniques, and this is called resource partitioning. So they'll all be, trying to exploit one broad resource, but they'll be doing it in different ways. So it's kind of partitioned out between them. And the reason why they do this is they benefit from each other's differing skills and abilities to detect danger. And also in a larger group, there's less chance that all the heads will be down feeding at the same time. So there's always someone up, or much greater chance of someone always looking up at any time. And if you're in a larger group, so then you've got statistically less chance of being predated, if you're in a group of 14 as opposed to a group of 4. So I get a loose kind of mixed flock between these guys, particularly the superb fairy wrens and the red-browed finches I'll see together a fair bit. The eastern yellow robin and the Jackie Winters have similar hunting techniques, but you can look at the points I've got underneath. So speckled warblers hunting on lawn, slow moving. Eastern yellow robins, they like being a vantage point. They'll actually come up to the edge of the house to eat bugs. But look at the speckled warblers and the superb fairy wrens. They're both hunting on the lawn, but one is very slow moving, the other is very fast moving, and I think that influences the kind of prey they can get as well. And then we've got the white-browed scrub wrens who will stay close to these guys, but they'll be over in the verges on the leaf litter, just under hedges and things. So it's really only as they're transiting through the lawns that you see them. And then the red-browed finches, so they're usually with the superb fairy wrens, but they're eating the grass seeds rather than any arthropods they come across. Okay, so this is just a local thing. Remember, I did this at a museum in Toowoomba, so we've got the Toowoomba Bird Observers and the BirdLife Southern Queensland Darling Downs branch. Wherever you are in Australia, I encourage you to join a local birding group. And in my opinion, BirdLife is the group to join, but just whatever's a good group in your area. And there's my bird bites. Presumably you're aware of that since you're watching this on this. And so I have been doing these radio interviews. I've only got a couple coming up now. The fairy wrens I'm yet to do, and then we're going to look at bird guides, books and apps. All of these are available on the YouTube channel, and I also put them on the Facebook channel as well. But the emus one, I haven't got a copy of that recording, and I'm just going to redo it a bit like a podcast actually. This, for people living outside elsewhere in Australia, you would have seen me kick up a fuss about some clearing that happened in my area. Please do the same thing in your area. We can't afford to lose more habitat. And that was it. If you have any questions, just pose them in the comments, and I'll gladly respond to you. Okay. And there's some links there. I'll post those links in the description as well. Okay. And that's it. Well, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that. So let's go back to a nice picture to end on. Just remember, as I was saying, you have a role to play in encouraging biodiversity in your yard. We want to get past these guys and get some more interesting birds like we've got here going. Okay, so thank you for watching, and any questions, just put them in the comments. And we'll just fade out on this lovely little character here. Okay, see ya.